Hey everyone, welcome to our in-depth tutorial on Azure Data Factory components. In this video, we will deep dive into various essential components that makes up the Azure Data Factory, Microsoft's most powerful cloud-based data integration service. Here is what we cover. Introduction to the Azure Data Factory, a brief overview of what Azure Data Factory is and why it is crucial for a modern database workflow. So we have covered so far what is Azure Data Factory and why it is crucial for the modern data workflow. Watch that video, link is given in the description above. Please follow that particular video. Now in this video, we will discuss the different data factory resources. We will explore the fundamental building blocks, including the dataset, link services, pipeline, activities, and all. You will gain a solid understanding of how these components works together. So if you remember this diagram, the sketch docs.dev, where we have understood the concept of, which we have used to understood the concept of Azure Data Factory. In the same diagram, the components of Azure Data Factory is also mentioned. As you can see at the bottom right side, there are 6 main concepts which are available with the Azure Data Factory: pipeline, activity, dataset, link services, data flows, integration services, and apart from these, there are few key terminologies which you should know, like control flow, pipeline runs, triggers, parameters, and variables. So to know more about all of these, we'll use this diagram as well as the data factory instance which we have created in our previous video. So I'll open the Azure portal data factory instance, which is on the adf.azure.com, and we'll discuss all these concepts from there. Let's talk about the very first concept, which is there in the top of the list. So here is my data factory instance, and here you have got a data factory resource, which is pipeline. So what exactly the pipeline is? Well, pipeline defines as an unit of work which performs the collection of activity. What do I mean by that? So let's try and understand with an example. Let's say I want to move a CSV file from the storage account, which is there in the storage blob, to a SQL server. I have certain rows in the CSV file, and those rows I want to insert into SQL server. So what I can do is I can create a pipeline in which I can define all those activities, like activity to copy the data from blob storage, activity to transform the CSV file into a SQL server, and then finally activity to merge the data into SQL server, right? So all these activities combine together as in pipeline, and that when you run the pipeline, it performs a unit of work as an execution, right? So the outcome is going to be copy activity in this case. So again, the pipeline defines the unit of work which needed to be run by combining the number of activities together. Now, if I just open the pipeline, you can simply see the pipeline as in create new pipeline that will launch the dashboard or the canvas or the workflow, whatever you want to call it. So that's my canvas where I put all the activities which I would like to combine together as part of this particular pipeline. Remember, I mentioned that ADF is a UI based tools. You do not have to write any code, though you can write it, but most of the case, why to write it if there are so many options available which is on the UI. Like a logic app, you simply have number of activities, actions, connectors available. You simply drag and drop and then basically use those to define your pipelines. So for an example, a copy data activity, I simply drag it down onto my canvas. What it will do, it will copy the data. Obviously this activity, this is represented by an activity. Now this activity would require some kind of a configuration. For an example, where is my source, which is going to be, let's say in our example, it's going to be the storage account as in source. and then where is my destination. So one thing to remember when I use the term destination, which I'll not be using going forward, because in the ADF terminology they do not use the destination term, they call it as in sink. And that is why if you look at here, you have got the source and you have got the sink as in tab, which means that the target or the destination where you would like to perform or send your outcome to, right? So combining together, I could have various number of different, steps which I can add to my pipeline, and then simply I can have changes linked together like this, right? So you can see that one pipeline is containing starting from copy data, then going to a data workflow, and then going to Azure function. So this is a chain of different activities together of building a pipeline, right? So that's the, at the high level, this is a conceptual pipeline flow which I have created here. I hope you have got the idea what the pipeline looks like. Obviously you can validate it, you can debug it, you can perform all those sort of activities. So this is a deployable unit, which is a pipeline which is performing a unit of work with the help of these different activities, right? Next, moving on to our next activity or next concept, which is activities. Now I mentioned when I was talking about the pipelines, I said that pipeline is collection of activities which performs the unit of work. So what do I mean by activities? The action or the components, each of these components which you are using inside your pipeline or inside your data flow are basically activities, right? So an activity could be an activity to copy the data, an activity could be itself is a data flow or as your function call. So these are called the activities, right? Now there are three different type of activities. Generally it is the activities are categorized into three different types. A data movement activity, an activity which can move the data from source location to destination location. An example is your copy data activity. An activity which can transform the data, right? So a type of activity which can actually transform your data. So this is an example, which is a data flow, which can basically transform the data. Let's say I got a CSV data and I want to basically transform it to SQL Server equivalent data, right? So that's the data flow kind of activity. And there are activities which are type of controlled activity, right? So what do I mean by control activity? So let me search an option with a control activity, which if I go to general, you will see that all these activities are, most of them are controlled activity. For an example, I want to apply some or add some weight to within my pipeline. So let's say for an example, I want to wait for 5 minutes before it jumps to the next step. I want to set a certain variable for an example, right? Or I want to fail a pipeline if something goes wrong, right? Or let's say I want to have a lookup activity, or I want to have a if condition or switch condition. Let me find out a if condition. This is an if condition or for loop, right? So this is a control flow activities which are basically going to control your logic, and it will decide if that condition meets or if that happens, do this and that. So this is categorized into a controlled activity. So I'll repeat again, there are three types of activities. Data movement activity, example is copy data. Data transformation activity, example is data flow. And then data control activity, examples are for loop, switch cases, if condition, all those things, right? So this is about the activity. Let's move on to our third concept, which is the data set. Now we talk about the activities and the pipelines, right? Let me just delete all these. See how easy it is. Now we talk about the pipelines and activities, and we also talk about the activity, a particular copy activity will copy data from this location and that location. But think about what kind of a data it will copy, right? Or what kind of a data, when the data will be copied, in which schema it will copy, what will be the scheme of data which you are looking for from a source system or at the target location or at the sink location, that you define or you can declare with the help of dataset. Think dataset as in the dataset which you might have used in your .NET programming. If you are if you are a .NET programmer like me who used to work on ADF.NET, we used to define the data sets, right? You define the data set in which you define your schema of your data set, just clone, and then your data set used to have the connection string or the connection setup with your target or the source location, source SQL server or Oracle database. And then whenever your program runs, it uses that source location and then basically fetch the data on that schema or the data set which you defined as an schema. So concept of the data set is somehow similar in the data factory. You can create the data sets to define the schema of your data set. Let me just create a new data set just to show you how does the data set looks like. Create new data set. What kind of a data you want to deal with it as part of this data set. So I'll say that, let's say storage account or block storage for an example. I'll say I would use an CSV file, delimited text file, right? Choose a link service. Now, it is asking for a link service here. The reason for that is you say that, okay, I'm trying to, fetch or connect to a data source which is of type, let's say, storage account or block storage, but where exactly that block storage is, that location you have to provide. And that is what it is possible with the help of link service, which is our fourth concept in the ADF. So basically a link service gives you an option to connect to the target or the source data type. And how it is going to connecting via the integration runtime, which is again another concept, right? So we are talking about concept inside the concept because all these things are interrelated, right? You can see that pipeline is related to the activities, then activity is related to the data set, and then data set related to the link service, and within the link service you have the integration runtime, right? So you can see that this is my link service which is of type Azure Blob. You give a name here, then how this link service is going to connect to your source or the target resource or the target data type, which is in this case the Azure storage account. We are saying that auto resolve integration runtime, which means that, okay, connect to this storage account and use the compute resource. Integration runtime is nothing, just a compute resource which Azure ADF will be using to set up a communication or to run the execution between one endpoint to other endpoint, in this case the source location. So here we are saying that use the Azure managed integration runtime, right? So we are not going to create those compute resource. You choose your own Azure provided compute resource, which is a Azure managed auto resolve integration runtime. Then you authenticate with the help of account key. There are various options available. Of course, it is depends upon what kind of a link service you are connecting to. If I'm using the SQL Azure block storage, then these are the block storage specific connection authentication options. So I have to provide that. If I'm connected to this cloud, this location, this is my storage account, I can simply test my connection, and then your link service will be ready if your connection is properly set up and it is up to date. My connection is done. So this is my link service which is created, right? Link service is there. Now you can see that you are able to connect to, from your data set, coming back to the data set, you are able to connect to the path in which your CSV file is there. So I can say that, okay, inside this container I would have the CSV file. So as of now I do not have it, so I cannot specify, but at least the file path, which is a container name, I have specified here. That's it. Click OK, and your data set is ready. Your data set is created. Now if you look at here, it's showing the schema. Like I said, data set is there to set up an schema which will tell you, okay, if you are going to use this data set, which means that this data set can accept this kind of a schema or this kind of a data from the source location. You might say, what if I have a requirement wherein my schema is going to be frequently changing? So yes, there are certain options available which you can drift, you can use the drifting of your data schema as and when it goes, if your schema is changing depending upon your need. So you have the option which we'll discuss later on, but think about it. It's a connectivity point to your source location. Then how it is going to connect is the fourth concept, which is link service. Just now we have seen that the link service concept, right? So let me go to the link service here. You can find the link service from the manage tool. You can see that just now we have created one link service which is of type Azure Blob Storage, right? It is of type Azure Blob Storage. It is related to one because it is being used in one data set, right? So as long as the number of data set it is attached to, you will have the relation to those number of resources, right? So I hope you are clear about the concept of dataset and link service, which are closely related to each other. So just to revise, dataset gives the option or answer to a question what you are want to connect. What is your data? What is the data which you want to use, right? So what question is going to be answered by the data set. Now where question, where is your data, is going to be answered by link service, right? Next concept we have is the data flow. So data flow are the flows which you can define for your pipeline. So for an example, the data flow shape I have added here while defining the pipeline, right? So I can simply click on that, right? Here, add an activity, and then, so that's my data flow, right? I can simply say that, okay, this is a data flow, click here, add new data flow. So what will happen? It will add a flow of your pipeline in which you can define if this data arrives, then basically do this job, let's say concatenate, do the average, or merge the column, add the inner job. So all the kind of data integration or basically transformation activities you can perform inside these data flows, right? Now the last and the sixth option is about the integration runtime. So if we go back to the connections from the manage option, we have a link service which we discussed, and next you have the integration runtime. At the moment we have when we have created a link service, like I said, link service is always going to use the one or other type of integration runtime because it requires your data factory requires some kind of a computational resources to perform all these activities. So in this case we said that auto resolve integration resource, which is of type subtype of publicly available managed by Azure, but it is likely possible that you may want to create your own self-managed integration, self-hosted integration runtime. Think this integration runtime as an Azure DevOps agent. When you deploy your manage your CI/CD pipeline, you have the agent of option to configure your own agent, or you want to use the Microsoft Manage agent. Similar concept applies here. You use the Azure self-hosted integration runtime or Azure managed integration runtime or self-hosted integration runtime, which you provision it within the Azure or on premise, and then you use them. Or there is some other options like Airflow, which is in preview right now, and then Azure SSIS kind of a integration runtime which you can use to lift and shift an existing SSIS package to execute in Azure. So that's the purpose of that integration runtime. So these were 6 topics we have discussed. First thing, I'll repeat, pipeline, which performs the unit of execution using the activities. So each activity represents an action which is getting configured, which is configured inside your data flows or inside the pipeline. Next, you have the data set, which represent what kind of a data you are trying to interact with it. And then data set uses the fourth option, which is your linked services. Linked services represents where are your connections. So where question, is it on the SQL server, is it on the and how are you connecting, where and how are you connecting to those servers, right? Then link service are basically always connect through some kind of a computational service which is managed through the integration runtime. And then apart from that, you have the mapping, data mapping flow, which you can create or define or design your flows within your pipeline, which you can use to run a subset of pipeline, I would call it as in, right? Apart from these, if we go to the apart from these concept, I talk about some of the additional concept, right? The control flow is something we have talked about, like how do you chain these activities, branching, custom steps, and all those things. Then once your pipelines are created, how once you send the design, once you create the pipeline, you might want to send the trigger, or your pipeline can use the variables and parameters as well. All those things we will discuss in the later video. This was just a summary to get an idea of how these things works together, what these terminologies are all about. And now in our upcoming videos, we'll take different cases and we will utilize all these concepts. I hope you found this useful. If it is, please give it a thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching it. See you in the next video.